In this session of AP Technology Week, we'll discuss fraud, fraud protection, and of course, some insightful and somewhat funny fraud stories. So let's get started. What's the biggest fraud innovation in the last few years you ladies have seen impacting the business-to-business community? And I'll start with that. And my example is how crooks can pull bits of information from here and there, from social media and other places to build their scam. And one of my favorite frauds, and by favorite, I mean just it shows how innovative the crooks were, not that I like it, was this fraud started with a tweet. The guy saw a tweet about a complaint somebody had about his bank account and the service he was getting. And he was able to take that information, pull information from other sources, and then defraud the guy, I think, of $7,000 or $8,000. So unbelievable. So maybe, Ellen, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that we're seeing most of, Mary, is what they call Friday fraud. So where somebody is impersonating, say, for example, the CEO or the CFO, and it looks to all intents and purposes like that actually is the CEO or the CFO instructing somebody, a member of staff to put through this invoice quickly, make this payment very quickly. It needs to be done. It's to a top tier supplier, for example, needs to be done right now. And the reason why we call it Friday fraud is because that's the most often time that it happens, either right at the very end of the day on a Friday, people are just leaving to go off for the weekend, or it could be before a bank holiday. So, for example, today in the UK is probably a very key day for it to happen,
Right.
Or certainly bank holidays and what have you. So that's, I think, I would say the biggest, I think probably you could say it's an innovation, because people have seen that this is something which happens and they put it through, and it actually works, and it works quite often, even for large companies too.
And you know what, Ellen? It also demonstrates, at least to me, how well the criminals understand the business process and the in and outs of how companies work. And they know enough to do it on Friday afternoon. The other time we see the popular around on this side of the pond is like at the end of the month, when people have a lot of extra work that they're trying to shove through.
Yeah.
And they're behind. So Kelly, let's talk. Kelly, you can see she's got pink on because she's the pink fraud lady. So why don't you tell us what you see? Because I bet you have a really different spin.
So it was interesting bringing up Twitter, because I have Great Women in Fraud, the podcast, and I've done a couple of episodes recently, and someone meets someone on Twitter and then they get them off platform. And that's when they get them off the platform, they get them to somewhere else. So even if it's like words with friends and get them off the platform, so then they start doing that afterwards, or, committing the fraud afterwards. As far as embezzlement, pink collar crime, I'm going to say it's kind of the same, except we have work from home, remote work. And I think that it's easier for people, and I think you guys know this, when you don't see your victim face to face, it's easier to commit a fraud. Yep. So embezzlement is going to stay the same, but getting people off platform, you got to warn people that play words with friends, or all of a sudden someone hits you up on Twitter, like, be careful.
So Kelly, where did we meet?
We met on Twitter, I think.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
So Lynn, how about you?
Well, when I think about, B2B payments in particular, of course, Mary, the big gift card scam comes to mind, because that has just been so huge, and probably your audience is already aware, but it's similar to what Ellen and Kelly have been talking about. Is you've got a fraudster and they're able to get into or act as or appear to be a CEO or other high-ranking official within a company. They go to someone, maybe just an admin person, someone in AP, who knows, and they encourage them to go out and buy a bunch of gift cards and, for like employee, reward purposes. And then it goes a little bit further by having that person scrape off the back of the card and take pictures of the code. And you can just, the rest of the story. Yeah. And despite companies training their employees on what this looks like, I've still heard from various companies that it happens. the fraud's successful.
And you talk about innovation and how the crooks understand how business operates. I was doing a webinar on this, and a woman wrote in. She said, we got hit with this fraud several times. And, you're thinking, well, how can they get hit with it several times? Don't you learn? And she said what the crooks were doing was figuring out who their new employees were. And then they were going after the new employee. So then the company had to make it part of their new employee training. But it's really, the power of social media. It can work for you or against you.
Right.
So I think that, some of these were pretty bizarre, but let's see if you have any more bizarre examples. And maybe, Lynn, you want to start this time?
Sure. And I know, Mary, I've shared bizarre frauds with you in the past. So I'm going to change it up a little bit and just describe one of the biggest frauds that I've seen. And it was something with the vice president of a healthcare company. This goes back several years, but what surprised me so much is the fraud actually went on for more than 10 years before it was discovered. And it involved over $700,000. But because it took so long for it to be discovered, there was a statute of limitations in the state in which it occurred. And so, when this person ultimately pled guilty, it wasn't even for the entire amount. But what makes this fraud so interesting, besides the length of time that it went on, it was multifaceted. This man submitted false mileage reports, false expense reimbursement requests, and also used the company commercial card or P card for personal use. So, it just goes to show that you really have to look in all corners, all angles. If someone is caught doing one thing, likely they are doing others as well. And I'm sure both Ellen and Kelly can attest to that. But so it just, you've got to pay attention to the warning signs, truly.
Do you want to add to that, Kelly?
I just did a podcast interview yesterday, and this isn't a bizarre fraud at all, but it was a psychologist who was ripped off in 1983, and it was one of the first things she said to me. So you're talking almost 40 years ago, and it was only $5,000. But she said it started right away. So I said the woman had done it somewhere else, and she confessed to it. And she goes, she had 6 kids. I wasn't going to have her, go to jail. I just fired her. But so 40 years later, it's still front of mind. And even though it was only $5,000, it stays with you forever.
It stays with you.
And she actually had a little guilt about the fact that she didn't turn her into law enforcement when I said, well, she just went and stole somewhere else. But she's like, I met her 6 kids. I wasn't going to have her mom go to jail.
Right.
So it just stays with us forever. So not bizarre, but just how it stays with us forever.
So, I remember when I was first doing this, hearing a manager that I knew tell me a story about 2 women who worked for him who went on a business trip together. Oh, he was furious. And they got, when they went out for dinner, they got the 2 receipts, the detailed meal receipt and the regular credit card receipt. And this was before anybody was asking for detailed meal receipts. So they got the brilliant idea, even though it was like $25 each, to both put in for the meal. And they had the same manager. He knew they went on the trip. It wasn't a bright fraud. And he caught them, and he brought them in, and he asked them, and they immediately folded, which was their mistake. But anyway, and he fired them. And it was like, you fired them? How, it was like $25. And he said to me, and he was right, Mary, they stole from the company. Yeah. So, and I know he was intellectually, he was right, but like your psychologist, you feel bad. Okay, Ellen.
Yeah, well, that's what they play on, though, isn't it? A lot of the times, it's our human instinct to trust and want to get on with people and to try and understand people, isn't it? And I think that, unfortunately, there are some people that take advantage of that. Yeah. Even just what you were saying just now about people going back, and yes, they commit the same kind of fraud over and over again because they're looking for the new employees, like you were just saying. It's just they've got that mindset, and they're going to continue to have that mindset until they get caught out, and then who knows whether they change. I guess some people might. Let's hope so. But it's just about people playing into that kind of trusting nature that we have. In terms of bizarre frauds, well, I mean, we report on various types of fraud nearly every week on PPN, unfortunately, because it's something which happens and happens and happens again, and often it happens in the same kind of way. And the one that I wanted to talk about is not really so much that the fraud itself was bizarre, but it took place with accounts payable manager, and she'd been with the company for I think 8 years, and it's a construction company, and kept on sort of coming in quite early, going home really late, and was doing things like suddenly she's got a brand new car, very expensive car, and then she was getting married. All of these things didn't necessarily flag any problem, but it was when she was getting married and she invited, as you do, all your friends and family, and invited some people from her work. One of those included her line manager and the CFO. And as they were at this wedding, they were thinking, they knew the husband as well, and they, how is it so lavish? How is it so impressive? It's just, well, amazing. And it was at the point where down the aisle flew a ring-bearing owl to the front of the aisle.
A Harry Potter fan, if I ever saw one.
That's when they thought something is not quite right here, and that's when they started looking into things. And lo and behold, they found out, like we were just saying just now, it's not just the one thing going wrong. They're actually being defrauded across lots of different areas, but because they trusted this person, they were not looking out for it. So I suppose that's the most bizarre way to be found out, I think.
By an owl flying down the aisle with a ring in their mouth.
I know, it's just pushing it a little bit too far.
Yep.
That's what I call a pink flag.
Yeah.
Pink flag.
So one of the things that I find frustrating is sometimes you'll look at a company and they don't do things to improve their fraud protection protocols. And one of the things that I find really frustrating is when you talk to people, especially about internal fraud, nobody wants to admit that perhaps they have one or two employees who could steal from them. And they'll look at you almost like, how could you say that? Like you're repeating gossip or you're talking trash about somebody. And it's just so frustrating because you don't want them to find out the hard way. So that's what I find frustrating. What about you, Kelly? What do you find frustrating?
You know, I would love to prevent. I would love to stop it on the front end. It's cheaper, but it's kind of like, going to the doctor. Does everyone go once a year or something like that? I mean, I'm not frustrated in that people have optimism bias. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. The idea that it can't happen to me because I'm really smart. I've made a lot of money. I only hire people I know, like, and trust. And it's like, but you don't know what circumstances that person is in. Now, an owl flying down with a ring, that was keeping up with the Joneses or whatever. But we can't understand what goes on behind closed doors and when people rationalize. So when someone will tell me, well, it can't happen here, I just smile because it can happen anywhere.
Yep. Lynn?
Well, when I heard your question, I was thinking immediately of, P-card or commercial card programs, since that's my background. And certainly it's hard to choose just one frustration. But I would say just in general, organizations, there are so many that don't do any auditing of their card transactions. They might rely on the managers of the cardholders doing a review monthly, but we can assume, right, that not all managers are thorough or doing a complete job during that review. So
that's a nice way to put it.
Well, yes, trying to be nice, but and then they'll bring in someone, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's an auditing company, once a year to then look at a year's worth of card transactions to identify ones that might be problematic or fraudulent. And so that's a frustration. I have consulted for numerous organizations where I've said, hey, there's a lot of different auditing solutions out there that are cost effective, that can show you not just potential fraud, but so much more. There are simple tricks, you can do with Microsoft Excel. So it's just a frustration that they just leave it all into the hands of managers and really don't pay any attention to it more than once a year.
Mm-hmm. Ellen?
I think ultimately it comes down to not getting the processes right. I mean, that's the most frustrating things. I think I said just now that you see the same kind of fraud happening over and over again. And I think that, and partly it's because people do want to trust people working with them, and they trust their own processes, and they don't expect it to happen to them. They expect it probably happening somewhere else, but not with their people that they know. And so they don't put the processes together to help protect them. And partly that's things like segregation of duties. I mean, that would help. Looking at the master supplier file properly and doing things like, checking for the in the long tail of the suppliers whether they've any of those are still relevant or still active, for example. But I think, also not checking for duplicates, which some companies don't do. A lot of companies are doing that now, but where you've got excessive duplicate invoices, they're not checking them enough. So that's the kind of thing that I think that frustrates me and frustrates us at PPN, is that people are doing the same kind of thing over and over again, and they're not doing the same thing over and over again. And it has the same results, of course.
Mm-hmm. So the next few questions that I have, it's one for each of the guests that revolve around their specialty. But before we get to that, I want to tell you these ladies have all appeared on the AP Now podcast. So if you want to hear more from them, we'll have links to those podcasts in the show notes. We'll also have links to their websites if you want to get in touch with them and talk to them. So now, before we get to the fraud specialties, I thought perhaps each of you could take a moment to introduce yourself. And maybe we could go Ellen, Kelly, Lynn.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'm Ellen Leith, and I am the Managing Director of PPN, which is the Purchase to Pay network based in the UK. And we have around 15,000 members of the community. And we focus on all things around accounts payable or procure to pay and procurement and finance as well. We run all sorts of events and activities like masterclasses, webinars, and we've got our annual event just around the corner, awards for the industry as well. So obviously news and information and research. So it's all here.
So I'm Kelly Paxton. I am the pink collar crime expert. I specialize in embezzlement, and I'm also known as the fraud hashtag queen. And my one hashtag that I want people to understand is it's position, not gender. This is not about me highlighting women committing any type of crime. It is low to medium level employees who steal from the workplace, embezzle from the workplace. It, however, is the one crime women really excel at. And I'm also going to say hashtag never underestimate a woman, because the woman may rob you blind. And there's a lot of business owners out there that underestimate Gladys, and they shouldn't. Gladys might be smarter than the master of the universe. So we have the fraud triangle: opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. We can control opportunity by internal controls. But rationalization, it's really hard to control for. So the other sort of side of my business is ethics and tone at the top. And your employees, especially Gladys, sees what the C-suite is doing. And they can easily rationalize when they see you not behaving well. So I'm just kind of out to get people to understand that embezzlement can happen in any business.
And Kelly has a book, which, by the way, you can get from any of the online books. Oh, there she is. Okay. And your other hashtag that is probably my favorite is hashtag trust is not an internal control.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Lynn?
I agree. And actually, Kelly contributed to one of the blog posts that I put out there through my website, Recharged Education. My background is commercial cards, as I mentioned. I've been handling those for more than 20 years, but also a broader scope with just payment strategies in general, including the latest instant payments. I offer consulting services, training, material or content development to the end user or buying organizations, as well as the providers.
Okay, so now thank you. And thank you all for being here. And now for our individual questions, let's start with Kelly. You talk a lot about pink collar crime. Could you explain to the audience exactly what it is and why it tends to go on for so long?
So the definition was popularized in Criminology magazine in 1989. And the definition is low to medium level employees, primarily women, who steal from the workplace. I say the reason it goes on so long because it starts really small and then it just gets bigger and bigger over time. And, in the United States, 3 out of 5 dentists get ripped off. So I kind of liken it to the fish tank gets larger every month, whereas the dentist or the small business owner doesn't notice the incremental expenses growing. And, here we have a lot of inflation going on right now. I can see people saying that, prices have gone up, cost of goods have gone up. And I can really see that happening. And it goes on for so long because it isn't one check for $750,000. It literally might be $1,000 the first time, and then it slowly increases over time. And so you just don't notice the air leaking out of the tires.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Lynn, you've been doing a lot of work around instant payments, sometimes called real-time payments. Unsurprisingly, there have been a number of frauds or scams. Could you give the audience an overview about what's going on and what they should be alert for? I realize you could talk for a long time about this. I know that because she's done several podcasts for us on it. But just, and we'll link to them below, but just maybe give us some highlights.
Sure. And you know, Mary, from our past podcasts that we've done, we've zeroed in on the plentiful news stories out there. Mainly they're focused on individuals getting scammed, but it certainly could happen to a business as well. So just using the example of Zelle as a payment channel, instant payment, real-time payment, there have been so many cases where a victim gets some kind of call or text that appears to be, well, mainly from their bank, but it could be their utility company or just, you know, other type of vendor that they do business with. And that fraud, it's a fraudster, you know, impersonating or spoofing. And the bottom line is they instill panic in the victim, in the targeted victim, because there's always some kind of story like, hey, did you make this $3,000 transaction? Or did you know your utilities are about to be cut off unless you pay? And from that sense of panic, then they, you know, come in as the person to rescue you, the fraudster, and they instruct you to do, in this case, what I'm describing, a Zelle payment. And before you know it, you know, these people have been victimized and they've lost, many cases, thousands of dollars. And so I guess the moral of the story is you have to be skeptical about every communication that comes at you out of the blue. You can't trust if your caller ID says it's your bank or other party that you think you know. You also cannot just jump and be panicked when something is presented to you that sounds scary. So it's just remaining calm, independently verifying who has contacted you. Perhaps it's just getting into your bank's website or mobile app just to check things out. But all of these just prey on people and making them, you know, anxious and scared. And then from that point, they just take advantage.
Yep. Yeah, fear is a great motivator, unfortunately.
Well, right. And it's even like what Ellen was describing, you know, with the Friday scenario. Just it's that whole let's get at somebody when they're least expecting it. Let's, you know, make a sense of urgency. And it just, they take advantage of people.
They do. And it's unfortunate. Okay, Ellen. So we're going to turn our attention now really at accounts payable. So I was reading a really interesting article on your website entitled Mismanaged Master Supplier Files. In the U.S., we call them master vendor files, but, you know, arose by any other name.
Yeah.
I was especially pleased to see it because many organizations never think of their supplier files with relation to fraud. Can you share with the audience how poor practices around the master file can facilitate fraud and perhaps identify a few practices that every organization should be using to prevent fraud?
Yeah, I think you're right in that people just don't look at it necessarily. They have lots of different controls and processes in place, but looking at their master supplier, master vendor file, somehow or other seems to come last at the list, bottom of the list. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's not clear who owns that process. And I think when you're not clear where a process sits, does it sit in procurement? Should it sit in accounts payable? And if that's not properly mapped per organization, then nobody has specific control over that, which means that a lot of the time it just gets left and gets looked at or added to on an ad hoc basis. And it can also mean that lots of people have access to it. So a lot of people have access to something, but not sure where it actually sits and who has overall ownership of that. The duties of that are not segregated properly, and therefore it gives the opportunity for people to add something to it. Not only, it doesn't even have to be somebody that's going about it in a fraudulent way to begin with. You may end up with just purely errors within your master supplier file, which can then be taken advantage of. For example, if you've got a multitude of dormant suppliers that you haven't used for a long time, then obviously people can take advantage of that if they see that. And not only that, is people don't actually devote the time that's properly needed to manage that master supplier file. It should be part of your process, like anything else, and part of your KPIs. Are you managing your master supplier file? But a lot of people just don't devote the time to it, and then they sort of they reap the results from that much later on. What there can happen as well is double entry of suppliers too. So, and that can be a mistake to begin with. But it can be something that somebody perhaps sees that's happened and takes advantage of that and can use that to their own purposes and then create a fraud on the back of it, either via, like I said, the dormant suppliers or the duplicate suppliers that you've got on there. So it just means that you're giving people an opportunity to commit these fraudulent activities. And a lot of the time, that's how these things first of all take place. I think, Kelly, you were just saying just now, it starts off very, very small sometimes and then builds and builds and builds. And that's what we see 9 times out of 10 at PPN, is that somebody has seen an opportunity. Maybe they made a mistake the first time,
Right.
and it went through. Whatever happens the next time, it happened again, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually, and sometimes, like you were saying, Lynn, it can take 10 years. We've seen fraudulent activities that it's taken upwards of 5 years to come to light. More often than not, when that person's gone on holiday or has left the company or something like that, so when they step away from that controlling that process themselves. So I think that if you don't want to place yourself in a situation like that, it makes more sense to properly look at your master supplier file and make it part of your proper KPIs, weekly, monthly KPIs, or a continuous monitoring process, depending on the size of your company and the automation that you have in place. I mean, automation has got a part to play in this as well, mapped with the right processes. But also at the moment, you need to be looking at your sanctioned suppliers. I say at the moment, but it's always the case.
But especially now.
But especially now, you need to be looking at that. And you don't want to be paying people that you shouldn't be paying, and you certainly don't want to be the headline of a newspaper either.
Right. Talk about bad publicity. Never
Yeah.
mind the money and the fines.
Mm.
So when I was listening to Ellen and to Lynn, not to Ellen, I'm sorry, to Kelly and to Lynn, it was reminded me of a fraud that I heard about years ago. And at this particular company, every year when they did the budget to actuals, they found that they had spent more on office supplies than they thought they should, but not enough more that that they ever did an investigation. And then, Lynn, they started getting level 3 data. And the first month, the level 3 data, which shows the line item detail of what that was purchased, the first month it came in, they discovered they had 12 salespeople who were going to places like Office Max and Staples and buying gift cards with MasterCard Visas that basically were cash. And then they were turning it in on their expense report as office supplies. And then they were using the gift cards for themselves. And to me, this just shows, again, the insidious way that somebody who understands the process can take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments on that one?
Well, I've written about a similar fraud, actually, Mary, where it's that level 3 data that accompanies some of your card transactions that shows what was actually purchased. And I had a friend actually who had to fire her admin because he realized that she was doing something like what you described. She was buying things from various stores, disguising them within their expense system as office supplies, when in fact, behind the scenes, they were looking at that level 3 data and they could see she was really buying things like groceries. And it was small dollar. So Kelly, you said like maybe $1,000. We're talking, this was $50, $75, but it was going on. And the admin person had no idea that the level 3 data existed. behind the scenes. So she thought she was getting away with something. So it's a, I don't know, I guess it's one way that organizations might be able to keep a closer eye on their employees, but not all card transactions have the level 3. But
Right.
yeah, it's crazy the way things are discovered, at the way crimes are committed.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, okay, so back to questions for all of you. Probably one of the hardest things to get many organizations to realize is that fraud happens to everyone. Too many people think it won't happen to them because they're too big, they're too small, or they're too strong, or as Kelly said, they think they're too smart, or some other fallacy. I used to work at a company where the controller literally said to me, "We are too small, nobody would bother to steal from us," until somebody got a hold of 3 of our checks. So what do you say to people who have whatever the misconception is, to get them to see the light? Maybe Ellen, do you want to start with this one?
Well, I think it can happen anywhere is the thing to say, really. I think that there's no such thing, unfortunately, as too big or too small, because you're not talking about the size of the company. You're talking about an individual, and that individual or group of individuals can work in a small company or a large company, and the different dynamics at play are different within each, but the mindset is the same. And in sometimes a smaller company, it can be easier to do because you haven't got that same kind of mapping of process with the say the technology that may be there to find it. And not only because of the technology, you may be more likely to trust somebody in a small company. So you can't sit there and think, well, we're too small, no one's going to bother stealing from us, because it does happen, and the element of trust that we all have within us and want to have within us is probably stronger in a smaller company when there's that more of maybe a family atmosphere. So I think that you know, unfortunately, it can just happen anywhere, and the thing that we need to do is make sure that we can control what we can. So put your processes in place. Imagine, almost you need to imagine a scenario where that is going to happen, and what we call over here wargaming. So you pretend that it's going to happen. If you were going to be hit in a certain way, what would the outcome be? If, say, for example, the CFO was going to commit a fraud and wanted to, could he or she do that with the current processes, and work from there? Work on the assumption that it can happen.
Right. Assume the worst. Kelly?
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I have this thing, I call it surprise and delight, and maybe it's just mystery shopping or something like that. So if your administrative or accounts receivable, accounts payable thinks you only look at checks over, say, $5,000, surprise and delight and pull a $1,000 one. If they think you only look at, you know, you get audited during the month of June, mix it up and try November. So it's surprise and delight, and it keeps them on their toes. And so they kind of never know what you're thinking. And, you know, all this artificial intelligence, machine learning in the world is not going to stop fraud. Like, we could layer and layer and layer everything, but at the end of the day, it's humans committing fraud. And we just, where you say it's like, it could be a small business, money is relative. What my price for stealing, I'm going to say it's exceedingly high, but someone else, you know, who's in a hard situation, $50 might be able to, you know, put food on their table. So they have to understand that money is relative, and what is too small to, you know, to not steal from, for someone else, it could be the golden goose. So we just never know. Yeah.
Right. Lynn?
Yeah, I think it is hard to convince some companies when they truly believe, oh, we're too small. I guess I would ask, well, how much money would you feel comfortable losing? You know, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but, you know, it's not just the money, which I think we're all saying here today. It's the productivity lost, you know, the time involved with dealing with things like that. So I guess, you know, if you think about us as individuals, you know, we're careful with our belongings, our wallets. We lock our homes when we, you know, leave for the day. Why wouldn't you do the same in a business scenario? And of course, I'm being rhetorical here, but I think too, it helps if you do run across an example in the news, just to always make the decision makers and the powers that be in your companies aware of those frauds. And while yes, most of them are sort of outlandish and quite large in dollar amount, just to hit home how it does happen, and it can happen anywhere. That would just be my suggestion.
Okay. So Lynn is aware of the following, one of my pet peeves, because we talk about it all the time. And I'm interested to see what the rest of you think, and you too, Lynn. About 50% of the companies in the US have company cards for travel, but they still allow employees who choose to use their own cards for their own and then put in for reimbursement. First of all, this creates additional work for the AP department or whoever's reviewing expense reports, but that's not what I want to focus on here. It also opens the door for all sorts of petty frauds. My favorite being buying 2 plane tickets for the same trip, putting in for the expensive one and taking the cheap flight.
Mhm.
Do you agree that this is a poor practice? Have you seen any other examples of games employees might play if they were allowed to use personal cards? And what would you say to stop this process, this practice of companies not mandating company cards? And how would you convince management to go along with your proposal? So, Lynn, you want to start with this one? If this is closest to home for you.
Well, that's a lot of questions you just threw out there, Mary.
Yep.
So let me use another example. So even at the beginning, when I mentioned that large fraud that was over 700,000 and took more than 10 years to be discovered, part of that, and it had nothing to do with travel. This VP had been over and over again submitting what appeared to be, cashed checks or copies of checks and an expense reimbursement request saying, hey, I just paid this printing company, and making it look like a business expense. Over and over again, he was reimbursed for supposed payments out of pocket to a printing company. Well, that was part of the scam. That was a false reimbursement request. When it was discovered later on that that printing company, it started out legitimate. The printing company went out of business like 5 years prior. And so then I was thinking, Ellen, as you were talking about master supplier files or master vendor files, that no one was paying any attention. Did anyone question, why are we getting reimbursement requests for something that could go through, the AP process? So I don't, Mary, my feeling. I would mandate usage of the company payment methods, whether it's a card or an any other electronic payment. Don't allow people to submit things for reimbursement. There is no reason for it. And some organizations might say, well, we don't want to issue a card to somebody if they're only going to make, 1 or 2 purchases. Well, nowadays there are so many, newer iterations of card products, like a virtual card, something issued to someone's mobile device, that basically shuts down after they use it for the intended purpose. You don't have to just issue a plastic card to everyone. So there are solutions of all kinds to eliminate the need to have anybody pay for anything out of pocket. I mean, that's my belief, and enforce it.
So most companies should, emphasis on the word should, have a policy that no invoices should be paid for it by an individual. They should go through accounts payable. For starters, if you pay it on an expense report, it's very easy to make a duplicate payment, just forgetting the fraud issue. But not everybody does that. So Kelly, I'm sure you have some views on this.
So I worked at one company, and when I left, they no longer required receipts for under $75. And so, and
That's
this
the IRS level, by the way.
Yeah, they so this goes to the fraud triangle and rationalization. Say your business sends you to New York City for 2 weeks, and you've got to board your dog, and it's like, so then you're like, well, I'm just going to add this to whatever. So they haven't do it. Personally, me, when I worked for the government and a large corporation, I would have never wanted to put my personal credit card on something. There's just, I'm lazy. Like, just here's my corporate card,
Right.
Instead of pulling 2 things. So, but again, it goes to rationalization and see, and people are crazy about like mileage and points, and they're
Right.
like, oh, I'm going to get
That's
points.
the rationalization they give.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to steal, you're going to steal.
So, Kelly, you bring up an interesting point. One of the statistics is the IRS level for receipts in the United States is $75. That went into effect in 1995. So we can all do the math. That's over 25 years ago. I think the last time we surveyed, only 8% of U.S. companies had the $75 limit, and most of them were lowering it, not raising it. Not that they think their employees are cheating or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Ellen, how is it over in the UK?
Well, I just think it makes sense to rationalize it, doesn't it? So let's not have all these conversations, and because the more time you spend talking about it, and looking out for any fraudulent activity, or any just sort of, doesn't even have to be fraud necessarily, but you're creating more work for yourself, more work for the accounts payable team, aren't you? And they're already got more than enough work to do. They don't need anything to be doubled up. So I think that it just makes sense to mandate the use of a company card, and that cancels out anything else, any awkward conversations that you might have to have. It stops any of that, and you could just say, well, this is company policy, this is the card. And like you're saying, you can easily have virtual cards now, pay by your phone. I don't know if you guys do, but it's just easy to pay for something, company, put it on your card, and that's fine. It's done. And then, of course, for the larger organizations, you can route that through into the rest of your processes, depending on the size of the company. But I think what's also important is that if you're mandating the use of something in one area, it makes people aware that you're an organization that cares about process, that you're looking at process, and that it then informs the rest of the culture of that organization. So I would say that it just makes sense to do it that way, from the word go.
Right. Because it's not like companies are adding staff to AP or the expense reporting, to do all this extra work. And it's talk about non-value added work.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. All right. So if you could give our audience one piece of advice for the B2B viewers regarding fraud protection, what would it be? And so why don't we go Ellen, Lynn, Kelly?
One piece of advice, I think it is really just to be aware that it can happen anywhere. And that because that is the one thing that it's so difficult to get across to people when you're talking to them about fraud in a face-to-face environment, which we're just about starting to do more now. You can see in their eyes, it doesn't happen here, can't happen here, but it can, and it does, and it happens quite often. And it's not like they have somebody with a sort of flag on this, I'm the fraudulent person. It's somebody that we think that we know. So I would just say, look, it can happen anywhere. So make sure you can control what you can, and then we can try and prevent it as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree. And, if you want to take a real deep dive, I would recommend the usage of a risk assessment. And of course, I'm thinking about it from a card program, but risk assessments apply to all sorts of different operations. So it's not unique to cards. So do a risk assessment to try to identify what your control gaps are. And then don't just file it away somewhere. You need to take action. I have read countless news stories about organizations that had, some type of audit, and there were audit findings, not necessarily fraud, but audit findings about risks, and the companies would just ignore those. Well, then you know what happens. A year later, the same risks are found all over again in a subsequent audit. So you have to be aware of where the risks and things can happen and take action. Absolutely take action.
Okay. Kelly?
I'm going to go back to the surprise and delight. Keep your employees on their toes, mix things up, and not just segregation of duties and cross training, but we see patterns, and the employees see patterns. And when they see you only look at certain things, they know you're not paying attention to other things. So I love the whole surprise and delight. It doesn't cost much money, if anything, basically your time, and it gives an impression that you are really paying attention to everything.
And don't underestimate Gladys.
Right.
There are 5 sessions in our AP Technology Week programs. We put them in one playlist that you can watch now. The link is below in the show notes, along with links to other resources featuring these ladies. On YouTube, a link will appear momentarily. As always, we greatly appreciate your thumbs up, your comments, your shares, and your subscribes.